Right.
Yes. Well, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. I have 3:03, so if it's agreeable to all, why don't we go ahead and get started? So, would like to welcome everyone. Today, we have a special town hall and consultation forum on barriers to prevention, barriers to treatment, and barriers to thrive. And this is the experience as a Black American during COVID-19 pandemic. As Elizabeth and Kia Ray and I were talking a few moments ago, when we started conceptualizing this, I don't think any of us could appreciate where society and our communities would be at today. And so we are deeply honored to have both Dr. Elizabeth Harris and Dr. Kia Ray Pruitt share their expertise, and equally so to offer us such a timely discussion, especially given the last couple of days. This is scheduled from 3 to 5 o'clock. Please take a moment and mute yourself. We're getting some feedback already. If you are not speaking, and we certainly want to allow Elizabeth and Kia Ray the benefit of being able to speak without the distortion. I'm going to stop the screen share right now. If you are on the Zoom interface, there is a chat box, and you can kind of just wiggle your mouse, or depending on your app, open up the chat box, and it's a way to ask questions. Also would like all of our attendees to introduce themselves and take a moment to say who you are, where you practice, and if you have any connectivity to any of our other groups. We are certainly benefited today to have our friends from some chapters of ABSI also coming with us, and so we are so delighted to also have several of you join. We have our two speakers today, and I'd like to introduce them. First is Dr. Kia Ray Pruitt, and Dr. Pruitt graduated with her PhD in counseling psychology from Loyola University in Chicago. Her dissertation focused on non-academic variables impacting the academic success of African American students attending predominantly white institutions. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology with minors in African American studies and human relations from the University of Iowa, and her master's degree in counseling psychology from St. Xavier University in Chicago. Dr. Pruitt has spent most of her career working with diverse communities in and around Chicago, as well as Northeast Ohio. As director for Mayor Daley's 22nd District YouthNet on the south side of Chicago, she collaborated with local community-based organizations to provide out-of-school programming for children and youth living in underserved communities. As an educator for the University of Illinois Extension in Cook County, Dr. Pruitt worked with diverse populations and communities and schools, providing access to youth development programs and early career preparation for underrepresented college populations. Currently, Dr. Pruitt is a clinical psychologist specializing in family services with the VA Northeast Ohio Healthcare System, and she is a member of the Psychology Service Diversity Committee and regularly presents on topics related to race, providing culturally competent care to veterans, and integrating cultural competence and supervision. And Dr. Pruitt, thank you so much for being a part of our team and sharing your time today with our attendees. We also have Dr. Elizabeth Harris. Dr. Harris is a licensed psychologist and senior clinical instructor in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at University Hospital's Case Medical Center. Her special interests include social, cultural, and systemic stressors, ADHD, comorbid anxiety disorders, disruptive behavior disorders, and parent-child relationship. She earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Toledo, a master's in psychology, and a doctorate in counseling psychology from Walden University. She completed her psychology training at North Coast Behavioral Healthcare, University Hospital's Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and in a Cleveland Westside-based private practice. She is recognized for an excellent non-empirical poster submission at the 2013 Cleveland Psychological Association Graduate Poster Session and was the winner of the 2015 OPA Conference Graduate Student Poster Session. In addition, Elizabeth is also our current Vice President of Diversity for the Ohio Psychological Association and one of our dear board members on our leadership team. Elizabeth had her research published in July 2015 edition of the Ohio Psychologist. And again, Dr. Harris, thank you as well for sharing your expertise, and to both you, Elizabeth, and Kia Ray, for your willingness to propose this town hall and consultation session. Again, please make sure if you're not speaking to mute yourself. If you're on the phone, you can certainly just mute your phone. And again, take a moment to introduce yourself on the chat if you're on the interface. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Pruitt and Dr. Harris, and please give them a warm welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for that wonderful introduction.
Yep.
So I'm Dr. Elizabeth Harris. I'm going to start us off with our conversation today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pruitt. But I'm going to start off with a couple of questions, and then I will present the problem and introduce some of the responses to the problem, and then I'll turn it over, and then I'll be happy to contribute to answering any questions that you might have so that we can have a good dialogue. So Black American communities have been getting hit harder with the COVID-19 crisis, but the question is why? And here are some questions that have recently come to my attention. Do Black Americans get sicker more easily? Do Black Americans not manage their healthcare needs appropriately? Do Black Americans avoid going to the hospital? Do Black Americans refuse to stay in place? The easy answer to these questions are no, not intentionally, but there's no easy answer when it comes to explaining how healthcare disparity began and how it is continued. But as the old saying goes, when America sneezes, Black Americans catch pneumonia. However, in this case, it's COVID-19. Here are some of the healthcare statistics concerning African American health disparities. Healthcare disparities exist for other ethnic minorities. For the purpose of this discussion, we'll be comparing people who have the poorest health outcomes, Black Americans, to people who have relatively the best health outcomes, white Americans. Diabetes is 60% more common in Black Americans than in white Americans. Black people are up to 2.5 times more likely to suffer a limb amputation and up to 5.6 times more likely to suffer kidney disease than other people with diabetes. Black Americans are 3 times more likely to die of asthma than white Americans. Death from lung scarring, sarcoidosis, are 16 times more common among Black people than among white people. Despite lower tobacco exposure, Black men are 50% more likely than white men to get lung cancer. Strokes kill 4 times more 35 to 54-year-old Black Americans than white Americans. Black people have nearly twice the first time stroke risk of white people. Black people develop high blood pressure earlier in life and with much higher blood pressure levels than white people. Nearly 42% of Black men and more than 45% of Black women aged 20 and older have high blood pressure. Cancer treatment is equally successful for all races, yet Black men have 40% higher cancer death rates than white men. And for women, Black women have 20% of a higher death rate than white women. And finally, nationwide, the CDC says that 1/3 of people hospitalized for coronavirus have been Black, even though they only make up 13% of the US population. Here in Ohio, Governor DeWine has said that 21% of the state's cases are Black Americans, while only 13 to 14% of Ohioans are Black. Here's the reasons why. Experts agree that genetics may play a part for the development of illness, but this only accounts for 10% of the problem. Social determinants of health are more likely to be the culprit, which have been identified in research to account for more than 40% of the problem. In other words, being a Black American doesn't put you at a genetically higher risk, but instead, living the experience of a Black American does. We must also consider that institutions that address these problems aren't culturally sensitive to include medical procedures, problem assessment in emergency rooms, and recognition of nonverbal cues. So back to those questions while considering the social determinants of health. Do Black Americans get sicker more easily? Yes, but consider that having the availability of fresh produce, having the ability to practice healthy behaviors to include sleep, exercise, meditation, and having the ability to meet basic needs in terms of safety, nutrition, and sleep are things that have an impact on whether one will get sick or easily recover from the sickness. Also consider that fresh fruit costs more than processed foods. Water costs more than sugary drinks. And some exercise and meditation classes can cost $10 to $20 a class. And when we think about Black Americans doing their part, we must also recognize that economics are playing a part. Do Black Americans not manage their healthcare needs appropriately? Yes, sometimes that's true. But consider that one must have knowledge of all available medical care, adequate health information, and access to quality healthcare to be able to do so. If it's not stated as an emergency, then why invest the time away from work, more copays, and a doctor bill if it's not mandatory, but in fact could cause financial distress down the road? Do Americans avoid going to the hospital? No, not when it's an emergency, but if they don't have the ability to cover costs of services, it's likely they will not seek out those costly services. Additionally, emergency situations are not always recognized as an emergency, especially when illnesses in Black Americans have the tendency to progress faster with deadlier consequences and little to no warning signs. So do Black Americans refuse to stay in place? No, but rather Black Americans generally have less financial resources to be able to stockpile. They're more likely to work in jobs that are considered to be essential work. And sometimes staying in place isn't always an option. Consider dense urban areas such as New York or Chicago inner city, where staying in place doesn't necessarily mean having the ability to socially distance. We must also consider that race-related stress may make one more susceptible to mortality for any cause. Some individuals have been afforded the ability to stay in place by accessing unemployment because it provides them with safety and full pay. However, removal of the restrictions in states allows them to return to work, where they may be making less money, not at the hours that they're used to, and it places them back in circumstances where safety precautions aren't always practiced in the work settings. We also can't ignore the fact that discriminatory practices exist in healthcare. But before COVID-19 pandemic, Black Americans had reported not being offered the same standard of care as their white counterparts, regardless of socioeconomic status and the ability to pay for services. So while the CDC has commented about discrimination against Asian Americans recently, there's been no mention from the CDC about the discriminatory practices against Black Americans and why Black Americans are dying at an alarming rate. They're being denied testing more often than other racial groups, and more individuals are speaking out on behalf of their family members who passed away because they were denied testing and subsequent care after several times presenting to the emergency room. Also, it's been noted that testing has been more available in areas that are more accessible to white Americans. In response, collaboration of COVID-19 tracking project and the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center has begun to collect data to determine the racial impact of the crisis. This information is being updated daily, and the recommendations that are provided to healthcare professionals to address these discriminatory practices have been as follows. Maintain privacy and confidentiality of those seeking healthcare and those who may be a part of the contact investigation. Quickly communicate the risk or lack of risk from associations with products, people, or places. Raise awareness about COVID-19 without increasing fear. Share accurate information about how the virus spreads. Speak out against negative behaviors, including negative statements on social media about groups of people or exclusion of people who require care. Be cautious about the images that are shared and make sure that they do not reinforce stereotypes. Engage with stigmatized groups in person. And share the need for social support for people who are worried about their friends and relatives in affected areas. And most importantly, where social change is necessary, be the change. Thank you for your listening ears. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, but also we'd like to introduce you to the reasons that Black Americans are wearing masks or not wearing masks in public and why that could be problematic, and discuss the recent racial tensions between Black Americans and law enforcement from both officers and civilians.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the questions that you brought up, as well as some action steps. As Elizabeth said, We're also going to discuss, the homemade mask wearing. So I'd like to provide a question as well as some answers to this specific question. So given, the racial disparities and health disparities that Elizabeth mentioned, it's also important to consider if African American communities are at a higher risk for serious illness or death from COVID-19, why are some African Americans refusing to wear homemade masks? Before directly answering this question, let's take a look at what research says about implicit racial bias and its impact on African Americans compared to white Americans. Negative racial stereotypes can lead people to see danger where none exists. This has been demonstrated through shooter studies, research that looks at whether race influences subjects' split-second decision-making to discharge a weapon in self-protection. Shooter studies have established that people stereotypically associate African Americans with violence and weapons. During these study simulations, subjects fire guns more often at unarmed Black people and less often when facing images of armed white people. In the criminal justice system, research on capital punishment has shown that killers of white victims are more likely to get the death penalty than killers of Black victims. Additionally, Black defendants are more likely to get a death sentence than white defendants. Other research has shown that defendants with more Afrocentric facial features are given longer sentences than defendants with less Afrocentric features. Implicit racial bias is inherent in racial profiling, which is the use of race or ethnicity as grounds for suspecting someone committed a crime. In a Stanford University study of 100 million traffic stops across 21 states, it was found that police stopped Black and Latino drivers on the basis of less evidence than what they used when stopping white drivers, who are searched less often but are more likely to be found with illegal items. Implicit racial bias and racial profiling have been indicated in the high-profile police killings of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, George Floyd in Minneapolis, and Philando Castile in Minnesota, Mike Brown near St. Louis, Missouri, Eric Garner in New York, and 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio. Additionally, racial profiling was referenced in the case of Sandra Bland, who was arrested after being pulled over for a minor traffic violation and was later found hanging in her Texas jail cell, and the controversial Stand Your Ground case of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, who was killed while walking home after being perceived as suspicious by George Zimmerman, who was a volunteer with the Neighborhood Watch program. We also recently witnessed the neighborhood vigilante killing of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. And we cannot forget Christian Cooper, who was bird watching in Central Park in New York, where someone recently called the police on him for him simply asking them to obey the rules. To go back to the question of why some African Americans are refusing to wear homemade masks, although they are at a higher risk of serious illness or death from COVID-19, the answer is fear of being targeted or killed because of racial profiling and implicit bias. Additionally, certain color bandanas have been associated with gang affiliation and violence, which complicate the matter for Black and Latino people who want to protect themselves but don't have access to a medical protective mask. Unfortunately, many Black and Brown Americans who are considered essential workers and don't have the option to work from home nor access to medical masks must make the choice of protecting themselves and others by wearing homemade masks, which could also increase their risk of being racially profiled or not wearing a mask at all. These fears are not just imagined. In a recent incident in Illinois, 2 Black men reported being asked to leave a store after appearing suspicious to a security officer because they were wearing protective masks. So this ends the proposed questions that we have. So now, Elizabeth, if you'd like to say anything else, or we can turn it over to Eric, who's our moderator, to see if there are other questions or comments related to the information that we presented. Thank you.
Oh, Elizabeth, I think you got muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I just wanted to say one additional thing. We just wanted to remind you that we're inviting you to share any thoughts or feelings that you have about anything that was just recently said. That, you know, this is a safe space to put it out there so that we can do our best to answer or help you through whatever concerns you have as best we can.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, especially if you're on the app, please use the chat feature. All of us will monitor the chat, and we can use that to help kind of present our questions for both of our presenters. And Kira and Elizabeth, we have a very thoughtful question from Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can see that both in your chat window.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm happy to repeat it. I was waiting for it to be less noisy in my house. So Dr. Pruitt, you mentioned the homemade masks being obviously a higher risk for Black men, but I'm concerned surgical masks aren't necessarily any safer. I'm just thinking of that doctor that was recently arrested in front of his home loading up his car. So I'm just not sure, what can we as providers recommend to help keep people physically safe from exposure, but also physically safe from being wrongly accused of something?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you're right. So just because you have on a surgical mask, it does not stop you from being racially profiled and targeted. However, you know, so the concern was really about the homemade masks, and there were recommendations that people use bandanas or other, you know, t-shirts or other types of cloth to wear the mask. However, you know, a lot of Black people were concerned about that it would just put a target on their back or increase the target on their back. You know, however, if surgical masks can be, or medical masks can be provided, I would say that would at least lower some risk. It doesn't totally take away the risk, because as you know, like you just said, just by the color of your skin, you could be targeted. There are so many different examples of people trying to do all the right things, and still, no matter what they do, they're at higher risk. But you're right, just because you have on a medical mask doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be less targeted. However, I think it increases your risk when you don't have on a medical mask. Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Absolutely. So another thing that I might add to that is that, you know, some of us either witness these things, some of us may work in venues where we have ways to intervene with people who might have misconceptions, and we as psychologists are the perfect people to educate. And that's probably the biggest contribution that we can make, and that is to bring to people's attention that they may be misconceptualizing things, and maybe help them to find a different, you know, perception, help them to understand what's going on, and to maybe bring to their attention what it is that they're doing wrong. Additionally, there's been conversely a problem in other areas like New York, Chicago, where there are dense areas where people aren't wearing masks, and they're being beaten or taken into custody for not wearing a mask at all. So like, you're kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place, where you're afraid to wear the mask, yet if you don't wear the mask, then there's possibility that you could be targeted by the law enforcement as well. So people aren't really sure where to go. So really, the best thing that we can do is to, you know, call it out when we see it, and also to educate those who are in those positions to make sure that that doesn't occur.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yeah, and to piggyback off of that, I believe that education is the most important, because again, you know, as Elizabeth just pointed out, you're between a rock and a hard place. So you could be targeted for wearing a mask, you could be targeted for not wearing a mask, you could be targeted for not socially distancing. So that education is really important. You know, I mentioned earlier about that implicit bias. So talking about stereotypes, you know, talking about that implicit bias, educating people about race. You know, so many people are afraid to have conversations about race. And so rather than have those difficult conversations, people ignore having those talks. You know, there's conversations about, you know, the talks that Black and brown people have with their kids, but we know white people are not necessarily having the talk with their kids about racism. And so it doesn't just need to happen in Black homes or Black and brown homes as far as what can you do to reduce your risk. The conversation also needs to happen with white people about how do you reduce, you know, that implicit bias or those negative racial stereotypes. How do you learn about people who are different from you and have conversations and learn not to discriminate against those folks based off of stereotypes.
Well, and if I can add, and I'm sorry if you guys are getting to this later, you know, one of the uncomfortable aspects of having the conversations about race is people who assume that because I am white, I am like-minded in their racism. And will say the most offensive things. I shared this recently that a patient just declared that she is pro-Hitler. And just a lot of things where there's just this assumption that because I look like them, it's okay to say these really offensive things. And then trying to figure out how to manage that in a therapeutic way, especially since it, you know, was kind of, I don't know what to say, sort of shocking that someone would say such a thing to begin with. So I don't know if that's something you're planning to cover today, but I'd really welcome some advice.
Elizabeth, I can start if you're okay with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think many of us have been taught, you know, how we're supposed to respond to these awkward situations, or, you know, all of us find ourselves in these very uncomfortable situations, and there never seems to be a right time to address issues like this, especially if it doesn't necessarily fit the therapeutic context. However, you know, I think one of the things that's very hard is that usually the burden of, you know, addressing racism falls on the people who have been discriminated against. And so, you know, it would be really helpful, I believe, for white providers to actually address these things head on. You know, no, of course, you can figure out how to integrate it therapeutically, but I think by not addressing it at all, it continues to maintain those biases and those stereotypes. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to change their behavior. However, if you don't want the impression that you agree with these beliefs, it may be you know, something to integrate into how you do therapy. But I believe until we start having these very uncomfortable conversations and talking through these things, they can't be addressed. But I don't think it's an easy thing to do, but I do think there are opportunities to address it.
Absolutely. To add to that, I'll just mention that I have a colleague that I work with that has a really clever way of approaching that. He is Chilean born, but appears to be white. And oftentimes people will make statements to him that are racially driven or discriminatory. And the way he approaches that is he says, well, you know, I'm a psychologist and I'm, you know, basically in the position to help and support you. But I too also have biases that I have to keep in check. And when I have beliefs or feelings that I disagree with in terms of like the things you bring up, then I have to bring those things in check for me. He states that like if he's unable to do that, then he might not be the provider for that person. So he just reminds them that, you know, he may be in the position to want to talk them out of or convince them that their thinking isn't necessarily appropriate or right. And if they don't want that to come up in therapy, then maybe they should look for a different provider. And that's just his approach to it. And he usually approaches it really gently and in a tactful way.
Thank you very much. I mean, we don't need to go further with my next comment, but I'm just wondering if part of that's setting specific as well, like outpatient versus inpatient and so forth. But that's definitely given me some things to think about. Appreciate it.
And we have sort of two different questions. As Catherine was typing, I was typing, and they somewhat link together. What can we do as we meet with African American or person of color clients this week to manage stress and violence from COVID, as well as just to help them be able to advocate and protest, while at the same time appreciating we also are in the middle of a pandemic, and those types of gatherings are probably inimical to social distancing and everyone not putting themselves at risk of contagion.
So I can, speak first about what can therapists do. So I do couples therapy, and, typically when I start my sessions, I ask the couples to reflect on, positive and difficult interactions that they've had with one another, as well as any upcoming challenges. So I did have a couple that I did meet with this week that we did check in about their positive and difficult interactions, but I actually brought up like, hey, I just want to check in. I know that it's been and this was a Black couple. I just want to check in. I want to see how you're doing. I know this has been a difficult week for society, and I just named it. I just said, these killings have happened. A lot of emotions are high. A lot of people are stressed, and just asked them how they were doing. So, and I told them, I actually set the stage. I said, we've checked in before about the pandemic, and we've talked about how you're coping, as an individuals and as a couple. But I would be amiss if I didn't also bring up this issue that's happening right now. And so I think just putting it out there, just naming it for what it is, saying that we know that people are having different reactions to what's going on, and allowing them space to talk about how they're dealing with it and how they're coping with it. I think that's really the best thing to do. So rather than waiting on them to bring it up, especially if you're a white provider. I know sometimes people of color may not bring up things in therapy because they feel like the provider that they're meeting with doesn't want to hear that, or that's not what they're there for. But if you can name it, introduce it, and bring it up and just check in and say, hey, how are you doing? This is a safe space to talk about it. I think that's really the best approach as far as how do you address that particular issue.
And to add to that, I wanted to say that, while we make up 13% of the population, the US population, oftentimes we, have disproportionately been affected, into the 40, 50, 60 percentile. So it's really important that we not address this problem alone. We need our allies. We need for our white colleagues, our brown colleagues, our everybody colleagues to show up. Also people that we don't directly work with. We need you to express your feelings, your thoughts, your positions. It's all welcomed. I think that part of a big problem that we've been seeing is that, sometimes there's misconceptions, both in the Black community and also highlighted in the media, that that's not necessarily the case, that white people should stay home, and that this is like something that you're not allowed to talk about, and that isn't necessarily true. There's no possible way that we can make change without you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've had, in the past, I've had some really interesting conversations with white clients as well, and their responses to racism, and what it's like for them too. So I think just becoming comfortable, there's no right way to, have discussions about race. I think sometimes people are afraid to bring up conversations related to race because they don't know all the answers. But oftentimes, marginalized communities or people of color are not looking for their therapists to have all the answers. They're looking for a safe place to talk about, these issues and the concerns. So having a safe place is part of it, but again, also being an ally, taking action steps. Again, I talk about that burden of a lot of these issues being on the burden of marginalized populations or people of color. But as Elizabeth said, we need everybody. We all have an important position, and we all can do something. I think there was another question about safety. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was scaffolding on Catherine's question, and just how do we promote safety, both physical but also social emotional safety in our African American community right now, as we are both trying to exercise the right to protest, have voices heard, but at the same time, I appreciate the fact that these large gatherings are certainly not going to help with our social distancing in the midst of our pandemic too.
Mhm. Yeah, what I've seen on the news, it seems like people are trying to keep that in mind. I've seen plenty of protesters wearing masks, but you're right. We also know social distancing is important as well. So, my take is that because of the issue and because of the level of concern about the issue, I think people who really want to go out there and protest, this is really important. And so they're willing to risk, possibly being exposed to COVID-19 because this issue of police killings and the continuous dehumanization of Black and brown people continues to happen. And so I would imagine that putting on a mask shows, okay, I am thinking about this pandemic, but I'm willing to go out there and protest because this is such an important issue, a personal issue.
And Sandra, you had a follow-up question, and maybe have you unmute yourself if you want to kind of build on that question you typed.
Yeah, I just am wondering how you guys are doing with this dual crisis as clinicians of color, and where you're getting your support, and as fellow psychologists, what can we do to support and help you? I'm on a team with several men of color who are from different parts of the country, and New York, Chicago, some real hot spots, and here I am in Columbus feeling pretty helpless to support them. So I'm wondering if you can address those things.
Elizabeth, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll do that. The best thing that you can do as a colleague who's concerned is to express that concern. Just like in how we approach therapy, we share some of the feelings and thoughts that we have about the things that we hear, and then we get responses. And also a good thing that you can maybe precede with is by saying, this is how I feel about it. This is, something that I know affects you. Let me know what it is that I can do or not do in order to make you feel that I'm on your team. And whatever you get is whatever that person individually needs from you. But if you say that to a different person, they may give you a different answer. Just like in therapy, how we have an individualized approach. But I feel that in order to make large change, sometimes it starts with the individual. Hence the reason a lot of us went into the field that we went into. We just start with one at a time, and we approach every case differently.
And how are you doing?
Thank you for asking. It's quite overwhelming. I'm doing well, but being affected by everything that's going on, having clients that are affected by everything that's going on, being a psychologist of color who sometimes is perceived as having all the answers for the patients that I see can be difficult too. So it's a lot to take in. It's a big responsibility, but the best thing that I'm doing for myself right now is the same thing that we should all be doing, and that is just like practicing self-care as much as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For myself, well, again, I want to say thank you as well for asking. It's been a rough week, I'll just say that. So, when, it's not just a pandemic or, this continuous racism, I think for me, again, being a psychologist of color, a woman of color, there's so much, I think about, my husband who's Black, my father who's Black, my three brothers
Absolutely.
who's Black, you know, so it impacts so many of my family members, people I care about. It can be overwhelming. And so, you know, I've had conversations with family members. I've appreciated friends who have reached out. I have some ongoing dialogue with some people, other psychologists about, you know, what are some steps that we can take, you know, to kind of help educate people. I've had friends reach out who are, you know, consider themselves to be allies and are looking for, you know, help as well. And so I think for me, being genuine about it. So, you know, whenever I have conversations, especially with white colleagues who really do want to figure this out, you know, but just not sure what to do, you know, when I have their ear, it helps me to be genuine about this is what you can do. And so I've shared some articles with friends who were really looking for answers. Because we, like Elizabeth said, we don't have all the answers either. So this is such an overwhelming issue. I believe self-care really is important. So I've had to turn off the news at times, you know, get a breath of fresh air, watch something funny on TV, spend time with my family. You know, these things, it's important to me. Reach out to people who I haven't spoken to in a while, you know, just to see how they're doing. So I'm trying to stay connected, you know, to folks and talk about the hurt and the pain that I'm experiencing, but I'm also trying to balance that with sometimes turning off the TV as well and disconnecting from social media because it can be very overwhelming.
Thank you.
And Sandy, I just want to make one more comment about your question in terms of, you know, helping our colleagues. So just before we signed on for this conversation today, I was a part of a group discussion with some of my coworkers, some of them being psychologists, some of them being psychiatrists. And they started a dialogue because they too were frustrated, concerned about, you know, their position and what they could do. And there was a lot of, you know, conversation in the beginning about, you know, maybe we should talk with the police, maybe we should provide them with training, maybe we should, and you know, there was a lot of frustration because there were people who had done that in the past that felt like they had a lot of, you know, impetus to do so when the Tamir Rice shooting had happened, and they felt like they were making action, and then after a certain period of time, it went nowhere. So I think that what to do, and these are exactly the conversations that we should be having with each other. You know, there are too many times where these things have occurred and we've asked, what can we do? We've put action together and put it forth, and then it just kind of like loses its steam. And we're just hopeful that this time that doesn't happen. And we don't know what to do differently, but the best we can do is anything we can think of.
I'd like to add to that as well. You know, one of the things I was thinking of before we logged on is how a lot of times we have these conversations in reaction to, you know, these horrible events. And I believe it's something, these need to be ongoing conversations. You know, there needs to be long-term planning in addition to short-term steps and actions. And so I think if, you know, practicing from a cultural competent way, having ongoing conversations about, you know, help that's needed, you know, looking at microsystems and macro systems, you know, like what can we do? You know, what can I do as an individual, but what can I do within the team, you know, I work with? What can I do within the organization I'm at? You know, what can I do within the groups, you know, that I work with? So there's ways that these things can be addressed, but I think we have to look at it from a prevention. You know, we do have to, you know, attack these things, but at the same time, if we can approach it from prevention instead of like reacting, I think that that's also what becomes overwhelming. And so it's like, let's start integrating this into our regular everyday practice. Then that way we're already, you know, getting to a point where we're on the same page.
Those are all very helpful, and thank you very much for your authenticity, both of you. And if I can add on a little bit and ask what you think about, I think about myself, if I were standing and being a witness to a clearly racially motivated police brutality sort of intervention, what would you recommend that a white person do standing on the sidewalk witnessing brutality like that? Because part of the problem that I see on the video is that the people who were witnessing, the police officers who were witnessing this, didn't stop it. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of comments from the people on the sidewalk that I assume were people of color. I don't know that, but saying, you know, he can't breathe, stop, get off of him, that were also completely ignored. And that just creates this horrendous sense of, you know, how do you interface with that? So,
you know, I'll start off. Yeah, I'll start off by saying there were a lot of thoughts, and then a lot of thoughts that I've had have since changed as different videos with different angles have come out. But the first thing I thought was the bystander effect. Like, you know, is everyone frozen with fear? Are they afraid of the consequences that may come to them if they do? Are they willing to put their own life at risk in order to save someone else's? Those were the first thoughts I had. But then there were other videos that came out that showed other angles, that showed that it wasn't just one police officer. There were like probably 6, that there were 4 alone that were on this individual. And then there were 2 more that were policing the crowd. So I don't know who the people in the crowd were. I don't think that really matters so much. But what I saw today in a video was that there was a police officer standing there that was making sure that they didn't intervene. There have been other videos that have come out that have shown where people have just put their lives on the line and they've come together and attacked the police officer that was attacking the person. And sometimes that's what it takes. But I think in that circumstance, there were so many police officers managing the situation, I don't think it was possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like I don't necessarily have a good answer because, again, we know about the bystander effect. It seems to be helpful to have video. I also think, again, too, like just the differences, you know, how I would answer as a person of color versus, you know, someone else who's not a person of color. Like the options are a lot different, you know, and so there's
exactly.
A lot to think about.
Exactly, right.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about. And then, you know, thinking about your own personal safety as well. So, you know, and again, what risks are you willing to take? You know, so if you take this particular action, are you, you know, prepared for the consequences of that? And sometimes things work out better than we expect, and sometimes they go totally, you know, not the way that we expect. And so, you know, my thought is video helps. You know, when it's more than one person, you know, that collective voice, I think, can also be helpful as well. But I feel like I just don't have a good answer, honestly, for that question. I'm sorry.
All right, thank you. I don't either. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think we had some other questions on the side.
I didn't want to hijack the discussion, but I felt I did type in some responses to her question, and I really think that there is a lot of power that white individuals have, and we've seen a lot of results of that. Even in the more recent incident with the gentleman who was bird watching and the white woman who called the police on him and felt the confidence to do that and knew that there was a possibility that there would be violence against him, and even said, I'm going to let them know that you're an African-American man, and, you know, kind of threatened him with it, which really prompted the person who was sitting with him to start filming. So there's a lot of power to do the wrong thing, and there's a lot of power to do the right thing. And I think that using that voice and actually taking the stance of overtly showing that you were filming and that you have some concern for the person's well-being may be just enough. There's just say, because an officer may listen to you more quickly to say, hey, wait a minute, this man really stepping forward and showing them that you're filming and saying, hey, this man looks like he's really can't breathe. He's saying he can't breathe. I'm going to call the station. I'm going to call news. I'm going to call your chief if you don't give him some room to breathe. I think those kinds of stances take a lot of bravery, a lot of courage, and I think we would all be shaking in that moment because we do have a certain fear of what would the consequences be. But I think sometimes you have to take that kind of stance to do what is right in the moment and take that risk, because with all the witnesses around there and you're simply just filming and stepping up and saying with your voice, I really feel that a white individual doing that will be much safer than an African-American individual doing that. That's my 2 cents.
100%, I agree.
Thanks, Josephine. I share your thoughts on that. And I've seen some examples of people this week, white people posting videos like, I just saw something, I wasn't comfortable, I just got out of my car and stood there and waited to make sure that the police didn't do something. And I appreciate that they're doing that and they're videotaping. But I know I must share everybody else's frustration that long-term justice doesn't come from these videos. I'm glad we have them. It's raised awareness. It's hopefully kept some people safe, but then we see, people get away with all sorts of things despite it being on video, and that's really disheartening.
And
I wonder if that
the-
sometimes makes it hard for people to stand up, just feeling sort of helpless.
And it also perpetuates a perception of African Americans in police. And unfortunately, instead of having more positive videos, we continuously are assaulted with these types of videos. And I think that another challenge is trying to make sure that our media is curating itself in a way that is really promoting not just these types of sensationalized and horrific videos, but also helping to frame a conversation of positivity.
Just the recent comments from everyone just made me think too, like some of the conversations I've had with white colleagues, just telling them, like, you have a voice, you have more privilege than I do. And so just letting them know, like, sometimes I just say white people have to say something, have to do something. That's just how our world works, and so, there is power in these collective voices. Like Josephine was saying, there might be less risk. If a group of white people that were saying, hey, stop, this is wrong, reporting these things, the message is going to be received differently than coming from a group of Black and brown people. And so I think the more voices and the more people who can be allies to speak up and to speak up against injustice, the things that you're seeing, witnessing. And it just doesn't have to be, these police killings, or it could be like these situations with the bird watching in Central Park. It can be at work, when you see things that are happening that seem to have, this unfairness to it. Thinking about like microaggressions, sometimes these little slights, the person who's on the receiving end of it has to figure it out and negotiate what they're going to do. But if you notice it, as an ally, that's an opportunity to speak up and say something as well. So there are I think that collective voice can also be very important, but also the individual voice too.
Just to make an additional statement about our position, but we're also leaders of social change. So advocacy is going to play a really big role in the coming days. I mean, right now we're talking about what we should do right now, but in the future, we need to think about what we need to do to prevent these things from happening again, in terms of our laws, in terms of, how we word our ethics, everything. I think the person who said it best is Killer Mike. For those of you who aren't familiar, he's a rapper, but now an activist, speaks a lot on behalf of the change that needs to happen for Black America. And that's exactly what he said. I understand the protests and what's happening right now. And then after today, tomorrow needs to look different in terms of our advocacy and our change in legislation and our reaching out to our senators and representatives to let them know that these things aren't okay with us, all of us.
You know, I apologize that I came onto the call late, but I understand that Dr. Pruitt was sharing about implicit bias and just, you know, thinking about the comment that was just made a little while ago about the news really showing these very horrific videos. And to be honest, there is such a strong need for those because even back during the civil rights movement, if the news had not shown the footage of Bull Connor and on some of the others just sicking dogs on African Americans who were peacefully protesting, I don't think the changes in our country would have taken place. I think relying on that, even the news with Vietnam, what happened in Vietnam was, you know, the pictures were worth 1,000 words. And sometimes it takes shocking video footage to see how problematic the problem is. I mean, even with the young man who was jogging, you know, when these two white males, a father and a son, shot him while jogging, the first thing people did was try to find footage of him doing something illegal, as though anything he was doing illegal would justify shooting him in cold blood, chasing him down when they're not the cops, number one, and he was unarmed. And I think if it wasn't for video footage that is shocking us into action, I think things will perpetuate. And I agreed with what Cindy was saying that, you know, sometimes we have all this footage, we watch it and things still go on. I think cognitive dissonance has a lot to do with it. I think as psychologists, we need to really dig deep and try to understand why people don't move. You know, Amy Cooper was the white woman who called the police on Christian Cooper. And she's a liberal, she's a Democrat. She did not vote for Trump. And yet she had some clear implicit bias. And I think it's really important for all of us to be aware of the biases that we're carrying that come out in times of unrest. The tendency, you know, when I go into the store with my husband, who's African American like me, you know, there is a response from people around us. When he's by himself, women will hold their purses, white women will hold their purses closer, go in the other aisles. I've had store people follow me through the store. Even as a PhD, I'm being followed through the store. And I guarantee you, any of those people that have done these kinds of behaviors, if you interview them, they would say, no, I'm not racist. I'm not prejudiced in any bit. But this implicit bias is so stealthy. I mean, by the nature of the term, it's hidden, it's implicit. And I think people have a difficult time realizing I am capable of bias. And so if you see someone in your neighborhood who is African American or different from you, and you feel uncomfortable, ask yourself why. What are they doing that is threatening? My son, when he was in high school, he was 17 years old, he's special needs and he loves walking around our neighborhood. He was walking one day and he was carrying a little stick and a white woman called the police on him. And he was in his own, you know, just one street over from our neighborhood. He was just walking. The police pulled up, scared him. He's special needs, so he started to run. They caught up with him, and they just walked him over to our house and called me when they got him here to my house, they called me. But he wasn't doing anything, and the police even said he wasn't doing anything. And they said, we don't know why he ran. I said, he ran. He's 20 years old, so this happened 3 years ago. I said he ran because he's aware of all the police shootings of African Americans, and he was scared of the police. And they said, well, he has no reason to be afraid of us. Yeah, he does. And, you know, this is something that we are living, and this is something that is real. And as uncomfortable as it is, and as shocking and horrific as the video footage is, we need to see it. We need to continue to have that put out there. Sure, there's great things happening, but those great things aren't life-threatening. We need to see the horrific stuff so that we can take a stand and we can do something, speak up and say, hey, this has got to stop, because one shooting of an unarmed person is too much. And the very fact that those individuals who shot the jogger Ahmaud, who shot him, they thought it was okay to film it, because they thought it was going to justify their shooting. And the fact that there were some people who said, well, stand your ground and citizens arrest is, all the justifications of the shootings of unarmed people. Breonna Taylor was in her own home and she was an EMT and was shot. This is a crisis, almost worse than the pandemic. The pandemic is unveiling, taking the lid off of the innate intrinsic racism in our country that leads to the disparities in healthcare for African Americans and for other people of color. And it's unveiled that, but then these shootings that continue and that have amped up are unveiling something even uglier. And I'm not saying one is worse than the other, but I'm saying one is definitely more direct. Like, people are actually taking actions to go against African Americans. People are calling police on African Americans. I got a flyer in the mail about that app that allows people to be like a neighborhood watch. And I thought to myself, maybe I should get on there just to make sure there's no more racial profiling. But this is something really, it's uncomfortable. And we know there are good people doing good things, but that's not life-threatening. Let's pay attention to the life-threatening stuff so that we can get that together and then move on from there. I'm sorry. That's my rant for the day. I'll be quiet.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add one point to yours, Josephine, about the justification, because of course, when we see these graphic videos and, even when people are united, as they, I think, at least partially initially were for George Floyd, then there starts the attack on the person that was victimized. So, he stole something when he was 5, and now obviously he deserves to die when he's 35. It makes no sense, but then there's just this somehow we give ourselves permission to just say he deserved it somehow, and it's just really, really awful. And I'm sure that's coming with George Floyd, with people saying, we didn't see the whole video, we weren't there, we don't know what led up to it. What on earth could this man have done to deserve that kind of outcome? Really, really nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to how people try and make sense of things that don't make sense. Like, there has to be a reason. There has to be something else, to explain why someone would do this.
Right.
And there's no good explanation except for the implicit bias, the racism.
Absolutely. And sometimes part of our work, by being psychologists and Black psychologists, is also engaging with, the Black people that are in our communities. There are some Black people that are saying to us and others, well, he should have just listened to the police and then this wouldn't have happened. Mm-hmm. So they may be subject to the problem, but may not even fully understand the problem. And then, with us being in the position as educators, we have to educate people that belong to the same community as us to say, well, this is a big deal. Maybe they did follow the rules, even though you haven't had this experience personally. It may have happened to somebody around you. And that's hard too, but those things have to be said by someone that looks like them, because they're way more controversial, and they would never hear it from a person that doesn't look like them, which, can be tricky. But in those cases, I feel like those situations are far and few in between. I feel like more people are willing to understand and hear.
He did listen to the police. He did listen to the police.
Yeah, it's not relevant, all these excuses people make for that. Well, and I decided earlier this week that, because there's, of course, people just feel comfortable saying, I'm not a racist, but that from now on, I'm just going to say, please don't finish that sentence. Like, but there's just nothing more to say. If you're going to start your sentence with, I'm not a racist, but I'm not interested in what you have to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is an interesting way to start a statement. So it's like, what is it that you're about to say that you feel like you have to make that statement first?
Right. Why the disclaimer?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Elizabeth, this is Mary. I know I can't see you guys, but so I listened to a really great podcast from NPR's Code Switching this morning, and it was a recast from 2015, and it talked about Rodney King. And what I keep thinking through this whole thing is how much videotaping of violence towards Black bodies, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's police violence, how much of that is it going to take for white people to wake up and make a change? Like, why are we so reactive? Why can't we be more proactive about shifting the narrative? And why is it that white people are so scared to intervene on behalf of our Black colleagues? And I don't have the answer. Like, I'm just bumbling through too. But every single person I've reached out to this week is struggling. And like, why did I wait until somebody was shot to reach out to my colleagues? Like, why are we so reactive? Why is it that I got asked, I'm a white person, I got asked to write a statement for OPA on racism stuff? Like, first, I'm white, but also like, didn't we do this last year, the year before that? Like, people are tired, Black people are tired. Like, so I'd love to know, like, how can we be more proactive instead of reactive about these societal issues? Like, clearly writing senators isn't enough. Clearly peacefully protesting isn't enough. So I don't know. I just throw that out because I'm frustrated. I'm sad. Like, I'm seeing people die and struggle, and I sit here safe, but my friends aren't. So I don't know. I throw that out because I'm just struggling with, like, first of all, why is a white person being asked to write the statement on racial equity for OPA? But two, like, why is it we're repeating the same information we've repeated for the last however many years?
And to answer your question, Mary, I feel like I can answer that in two ways. Number one, sometimes it's hard for some people to recognize things that aren't happening directly to them. So it's easy to forget. Also, even if it is directly happening to them, sometimes, you know, they like to stay in comfortable bubbles and say, okay, I'll address this while it's a problem. But then once it's no longer a problem, you go back to your comfortable bubble. And I think that's where the biggest problem lies. We tend to forget all too often, but it's happening over and over and over. And at some point we need to ask ourselves how many times we need to tell ourselves to forget. And why is this still even a conversation? I feel like this time around may or may not be different, but what I saw differently was that there are images showing that we've gotten the attention of people all around the world. There are visuals being held in Iran in solidarity, all because of the incident that happened to George Floyd, not because of this one happening, but because this one seemed to be the tip that just, you know, just pushed everyone over to the edge. The fact that there's, you know, just disarray seemed to be the one thing, maybe on top of the fact that everyone is quarantined, that got the attention of the whole world.
I think it can be a little bit discouraging to try to advocate for change when our state government and our federal government are so against change in this area. I know OPA has done things over the years to try to advance change efforts, and sometimes it feels like we're on pause when the administration is not in favor of these changes. I don't know if there are coalitions in Ohio or actions we can try to sort of get involved in now and then maintain and sustain that through hopefully changes of administration.
I was thinking too about policy and systems. Like there has to be policy changes as well. You know, so many of these disparities are because of policies that have been set in these systems, and so I think that's also part of the answer. And then just, you know, one of the questions that was proposed as well is why aren't, you know, people saying anything? In some ways, I think that can be a personal reflection. You know, think about how come I haven't said anything. So like if you identify as someone who cares about the issue, you know, personally reflecting, like what is it that's stopping me from saying something? I think there's risk for anybody to say something. One, risk that, you know, you could be retaliated against, risk that someone won't hear you, you know, risk of rejection. So there's a lot of reasons why people might not say anything. And I think part of that is a self-reflective journey, but also if you have a system that doesn't support, you know, these things either, it can make it difficult to speak out. Or if you feel like you've got to have all the right answers or, you know, so like there's this thing of perfectionism, like I have to have it right if I'm going to say something. So, you know, there could be a lot of reasons why someone might not say anything or speak up.
Yeah.
You are so generous.
And also, I think that
I mean,
truly,
it's not, yeah,
yeah.
So it's not about generosity. I just think, you know, people are scared. You know, I think there's a lot of different reasons, you know, and I think about the conversations that I've had, but I think some of it is self-reflection. Or some of it could be that people actually hold some of these beliefs and so they don't want to speak out. So there could be any number of reasons. But I think, you know, if this is something important, I think that self-reflection and then having conversations with other people, again, that collective voice can be really important as well. And Elizabeth, I know you were going to say something too.
Yeah, I mean, also you have to consider that part of this is making yourself really uncomfortable. Like if you think about the world as you know it, like everyone likes to stay in their happy place and think that, like, you know, things are good, you know, people are inherently good. But then when you start thinking like, wait a minute, there's racism all around me in healthcare, in education, in the justice system, in every institution that we have, that makes you really uncomfortable. That makes you wonder, like, oh my gosh, do I belong here? What have I been doing all this time? Am I contributing? And that's a really hard thing to even bring to your awareness, let alone try to change it.
Mm-hmm.
So we understand the struggle that it takes for one to even like come to the understanding that these things have been in existence in our institutions, some of which that have even promoted some.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even to piggyback on that, I was actually thinking about, we talk about a lot of times with our clients, distress tolerance, and we talk about how do you tolerate distress. I think we have a low distress tolerance. You know, a lot of people have a, you know, like Elizabeth said, we kind of want to be in our happy place. And so there's a lot of distress that comes up when you think about having to address racism. And so how do you, you know, work through that distress tolerance? You avoid it. And so I feel like a lot of people are also, you know, for their own distress tolerance, because they can't tolerate the distress, you know, for their own protection, they avoid having the conversation.
I would also wonder too, how do we have these conversations outside of our sort of selective cohort? You know, like today I'm struck, for example, we have almost 3,900 psychologists in Ohio and 2,800 school psychologists. And yet, take away the association leaders, we have 7 of us on here. And these conversations are so important, but they always seem to be like when I go to community events in the Akron metro area, it's always the same population of folks. Mm-hmm. And yet I don't see the ideas getting anywhere outside of that cohort, so to speak, of folks who are committed to the work. And then, you know, a lot of us live in urban areas, but we forget that the values and the perceptions sometimes change very dramatically outside of our urban areas in Ohio. And, you know, how do we actually get some of the same messaging across? I think, Catherine, you had asked about coalitions, and Kira, you had mentioned policy change. And I think those are 2 important parts here, because this conversation has to go much more than just the caption folks on this team, for example, even as OPA, if we want to try to advance any sort of change or try to move this narrative forward.
One thought I have is training, you know, having access to, you know, organizations that you may network with, who, you know, maybe there is someone like an ally in that organization who is looking to expand upon, you know, having these conversations in their organizations. And so, you know, our identity as psychologists, you know, we can talk about these things, we can educate people about racism and the impact of racism. And so that's one thought I have is finding someone or maybe even approaching, you know, organizations about having trainings, you know, on diversity and talking about these experiences, because we know that a lot of organizations are lacking in their conversations related to diversity and these issues. We also know in training programs, psychology training programs, you know, programs look very different. You know, some programs are actively talking about these issues, whereas other programs, it might just be one class, you know, or a conversation in a class. And so, you know, I think there needs to be training for psychologists, but also training and networking and reaching out to other organizations outside of our circles.
And having attended a number of diversity trainings, I mean, I think it does go back to what Eric was saying. The people who want to learn are there to learn, and those, you know, who are forced to be there are forced to be there. I just feel like sometimes there's just a lack of empathy. I wish we could just teach people empathy, because that's, someday it could be us. It could be whatever group is going to be marginalized. Why can't we just see that we're in a position to help now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And one thing that affects the change in people's behavior is law. So I agree that the training needs to be there, and it also needs to be mandatory. The people that come by force need to be made to be there by force, and eventually they'll see the error, hopefully. You know, there's always going to be those people who will never get it. Those people, you know, you can't make the horse drink the water. But can we at least start by making these things mandatory? Like cultural competency in the hospital where I work is an option. It's an optional training. No one is going to do an optional training when you're busy.
Yep.
It's
yeah,
amazing.
I agree. And even making it mandatory. Oh,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, there's like a delay. Eric, go ahead. Were you talking? I think there's a delay in my.
Well, you know, I was thinking about what Elizabeth has said about laws, but our laws are so malleable and so subjective to the political whims of the moment. You know, I work in education, so we have seen unbelievable peelbacks of Title IV and Title VI and Title IX in the last 2 or so years. And so where we might have leaned on law to try to advance any number of civil rights causes, now we're seeing diminution of those same protections.
One of the things I would add too is just thinking about different systems that we encounter with, you know, with the mandatory training. I think it also comes with a cultural shift. So if the expectation is set that this is something that's valued, this is something that's important, we expect everyone to participate in this, and you will participate in this, whether they like it or not. But it sets the tone almost of, if you don't participate in this, then you're not a part of this culture of inclusion. And so I think that also sets the tone too of what's expected in that particular organization. And so if it's an option, you know, to think about diversity and how we can be more inclusive and treat each other with more respect and humanity, if that's an option, then like Elizabeth said, I'm going to do my work. And so, and unfortunately, you have people making that choice. And so I think part of it is a cultural shift too, and setting the expectation that this is important and this is what we expect, especially as providers, you know, working in Cleveland, you know, we have diverse people that we're working with. And so it's important to be culturally competent. And so if you're not getting that knowledge and it's not expected to do these things, then you're also providing a gap in the services that you're providing.
Are there some other questions or thoughts that we can continue the conversation? It's closing in on about 4:25 and we're scheduled up until 5 o'clock. So we still have about 35 or so minutes that we can work with.
I have a question, but I'm kind of formulating it in my head, so bear with me here. But I'm just thinking, you know, prior to this week's event, we were all struggling as a world to adjust to the pandemic and social distancing and quarantines and all of that. So I know for myself, I've been missing my usual ways of dealing with problems. I can't just go out with my friends because I had a bad day, or, you know, all sorts of things. And so now on top of it, and for marginalized groups who've already already restricted in so many ways, and they can't necessarily use their pre-COVID coping strategies, I just would love to figure out how to offer some resources. Zoom calls are great, but that's not the answer for everything.
So you say you're looking to connect people with resources or think about how they can stay more connected?
Yeah, anything, just because again, we don't have, I know at least for myself, I don't have my usual fallbacks for things that make me feel better. And I imagine that's true for a lot of people. And so just trying to figure out how to be creative in offering support for folks with this week's events, with the pandemic, anything at all that will just help people feel connected. For example, at my current job, I see a lot of older folks who are absolutely not comfortable with technology. So even when I'm in the room with the patient and I can call, you know, FaceTime with their family members, like that's not going to continue when they leave the hospital. So I'm just trying to be creative in helping people find other ways to cope that might just be novel to them.
I mean, my first thought, I think, is just ask them. So, you know, like asking them, how are they like, one, are they feeling isolated? Do they feel disconnected? So just assessing that first, and then finding out, you know, what supports do they have? Are they able to identify anything? Are there some resources that we may be able to provide? So I would kind of start there first to see, you know, who is supporting them. You know, thinking like if it's an older, like you said, an older patient, for example, you know, is someone coming to bring them meals or someone checking in on them? You know, I know a lot of people are staying connected. I know a lot of faith-based organizations are, you know, providing online streaming. And so it seems like there's quite a few people who are starting, you know, to use that technology because they want to stay connected to their faith organizations, but it could be a phone call. You know, so I would, you know, at least start out with what they're currently doing and what their needs are, and kind of brainstorm based off of just what they're telling you.
I've also challenged people that I've worked with to use their frustration as you know, energy to do something productive with it. You know, just stay a little bit angry, you know, keep some of that anger and put it toward doing something that you didn't think that you could do or ever would do. Think about like what you would want to see happen or what you would want to see change, and think about ways that you can make a contribution to that. So I usually encourage people not to get rid of all of their anger, because that again is how we forget all over again. And in order to progress this from where we are right now, it's important to stay just a little bit angry so that you can just motivate yourself to be a leader. What I'm seeing too often, which is somewhat frustrating to me, is people saying, we need a leader, we need a leader. No, you are the leader. You can change, you can do in your own little ways. We all have like our own platforms. We all have different ways that we can make things a little bit better for ourselves or the next. And that's what I hope that people will do right now.
Elizabeth, you maybe reminded me of that anger. I think it's important to let people, you know, express their anger. You know, this is so appropriate, you know, to be angry, you know, to have these feelings, to be frustrated, and giving people that space, and recognize that it's not personal. Or maybe, you know, maybe you do have a stimulus value, you know, that is bringing some things up. So I know for myself, I've had to set boundaries, you know, into, you know, interacting in certain spaces, you know, so I've had to say, you know what, I cannot interact in this space right now. because it's just going to bring up too many other emotions that are just going to be, not productive. So, but I think allowing people to have that space to be angry as well is also important.
I jumped in on a conversation yesterday between two acquaintances where it was, I've watched them go back and forth about politics a whole bunch, and this time I weighed in, where it was really, they're both small business owners, and the white woman was saying, but if people are angry, I'm at risk now. And it was just kind of interesting to see how this conversation unfolded. My business could get burned, my health could be risked, maybe I'm not safe, and so this anger has to stop, not the underlying cause. It was just kind of a interesting conversation that I don't know got resolved, but just to see, that was an exercise in empathy that got completely missed.
Mm-hmm.
That now, because of my race, I might be vulnerable because someone else is mad, and so it just has to stop being mad. Everybody's got to stop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the important things that's come up in these protests is that so many people of color are saying, like there's a lot of criticism about, the violence that's occurred. And we know it's not from all of the protesters, but at the same time, people are traumatized, and it keeps happening. And what we know what can happen when people are traumatized. We know the different ways that people feel and how they express, their feelings when they're traumatized. And so we also know that people of color have tried to do peaceful demonstrations, and that hasn't gotten them anywhere either. So, it's kind of like there's this dictation sometimes on people of color on how what's appropriate, as far as how they should express their frustration or anger. And, if you're feeling helpless, if throwing a brick at a store, I'm not condoning it, but at the same time, if that's all you know to do at this point, you tried to be peaceful. We're still getting killed. Throwing something is a way that we know, people express their anger. Now, yes, it may cause a business owner to have to deal with that, and could potentially threaten somebody else's safety. But sometimes we know that that's how people, when they're feeling powerless and helpless, sometimes people go to those actions as well. So addressing the problem is really the issue. If there was not this force that was used on people unnecessarily, and then maybe we wouldn't see the violence that occurs. If people of color were treated with humanity and these issues were addressed systemically and on the individual level, then maybe we wouldn't get to these points of people rioting.
And I want to credit the small business owners, the corporations, and even some of the senators, or governors, Governor DeWine made a statement after the riots in Columbus on the first day, and he said, you know what, you are appropriately angry, we'll rebuild later. And that's exactly what a lot of business owners have been saying. They're saying, oh, I have insurance, I can rebuild that, I can fix that up. But this isn't okay, lives are lost. So I think that people have been overwhelmed with hearing those things from people when they say, you know what, I'm losing money, but people are losing lives, and that's more important.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to, go ahead, please.
Go ahead, Sandra.
I'd just like to make a comment about my difficulty with diversity training. I think it's really, really important. I don't want to undermine that, but I think that you said, actually, is it Kia Ray? Is it? Mm-hmm. I think that you said, and I agree with this, that it's one relationship at a time. And the diversity training gives us facts and information, which is really important, but it doesn't give us heart. How do we get there? I think that's how do we get the general population, how do we get past fear of each other? Mm-hmm. How do we enter into brave spaces as opposed to safe spaces, which is probably a new terminology that you're familiar with from some of the training that I've done. to put your ego on the line, to open your heart, and to really make connections with people from diverse cultures. And I think that it's that, I think that's the doorway that we have to go through, that diversity training on a corporate level misses. Mm-hmm. And secondly, that we have to also deal with embodied racism, that this business about a Black person walks through a store and the white women clutch their purses, right? That's a physical manifestation of racism, that we have to get into that level of physically embodied reactions, that if we don't do that, that we still carry it. We can cognitively say, oh, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe, but our bodies are like this and our hearts aren't open. And I don't know how to do that, but I just see this as being a big deficit in what we attempt to do in terms of diversity training.
Mm-hmm. I think experiential, so not just like you said, the training, but having experiences. I know there's research to support, when diverse groups work together, they're more likely to change, some of their attitudes if they're put into a similar situation where they have to solve problems together. So I think, but part of that is also having a diverse workforce. And so again, I think it comes with policy changes, but also, hi, I see you've got somebody joining you, but also, so policy changes, but also having a diverse workforce. Again, this cultural, the cultural expectation that diversity is important. Creating safe spaces for people to be able to have these conversations. Again, integrating it, not just the training, but let's make this a way of how we practice on a day-to-day basis. But also, if you don't have a diverse workforce, then finding opportunities outside of your workspaces to actually have positive experiences with other people who don't look like you, so that
I would love to see OPA create some opportunity for that. I mean, even to start with us as practitioners, to start there and to have our own experience, but to create something that we could offer to the public, programs that we could offer to the public that is specifically, this is diversity training. We're going to take people from diverse cultures from nationwide, or I don't know, whatever, and we're gonna all do a Habitat for Humanity together, and we're gonna build a house, and we're gonna at the end of the day, we're going to sit down and we're going to process what just happened, and have clinicians helping people process their fear, their frustrations, their insights, their ahas. I just think we're missing it in our didactic trainings. Yeah. And so, I mean, if anybody is interested in creating a subcommittee to create something like that, man, I am in. Call me.
Well, and if I can, I'm sorry, I walked away for a second, but Sarah, I don't know if you want to say some of the great things that were planned prior to quarantine in terms of limited food resources and working at food banks. And so there were efforts in play to try to at least bring us together as an organization to be community minded. And then the quarantine happened. But Sarah, I wonder if there's just a natural spin from what you're already, trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I love this idea that you bring up, Sandy. And we were, with COSR, we were trying to think of ways to kind of get involved in some of these things. And especially with stuff with food insecurity and getting involved in food banks and things like that, a lot of it was put off with the pandemic. But I definitely think doing something focused on diversity would be great to consider.
Something active and processing it at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Like an actual activity where we're all doing something together and engaging in something together.
Right.
Well, and Sandra, we certainly could make some linkages between COSAR, our Committee on Social Responsibility, and our Education Committee towards that end.
Awesome.
And then certainly, you know, we could link you into that conversation if you would be interested.
Very much so.
Of course, unfortunately, we still have the overarching specter
I
of this
know.
of the coronavirus, and at this point, you know, there is nothing on the foreseeable future that suggests that we're going to be gathering in person, at least in the fall, for any sort of in-person anything.
Right, which adds to the frustration of this time. It's just it's crazy making.
I wonder too if this is something the diversity committee could get involved with in terms of planning, in addition to, you know, COSR as well. But
maybe the two committees together. I am a member of the diversity subcommittee. I haven't attended a meeting much this year, but there's just been other things. But and in part, it's because I have this hunger for taking action and not just having it be here.
Well, I think that goes too with what Mary was saying earlier, and like, how do we be proactive instead of reactive all the time? And I definitely think that's something that comes up a lot, is like something happens and we all have this very strong response and feelings that we don't know exactly what to do with, and people get very angry, which is very, very, very justified based on what's going on. But that could be a way that we're sort of trying to be proactive instead of only just reactive, you know?
Yeah, sounds great. Do it in masks.
Yeah, so essentially what we're suggesting, and what you suggested, Sandy, is that there should be some level of exposure, you know, exposing yourself to things that may be uncomfortable to you, just to learn the other side of the coin, just to connect with another person who has an experience different from yours. And that's exactly what needs to happen. There are people that are going to be resistant to that change, but for those of you who are ready, we're ready for you.
There was a program in South Africa after apartheid where the tensions were still really high. And I don't know if it was a church, I don't remember if it was a church community that organized this, but they would have a white family go into a black family's home for dinner. And they would have and vice versa. And it did more to change race relationships in that country than anything else. And I thought, God, so simple. And it's so brilliant. That. Yeah. Just.
That's kind of like a culture. I was thinking about the work I used to do when I was at U of I Extension. Part of the work I did was volunteer management, so working with the 4-H programs. And we would do a cultural exchange with the 4-H kids who are more rural areas and the 4-H kids who are more from like Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. And we would do exchanges, and we would have the kids, we would do one weekend where we would take the kids from Chicago down to the rural area, and we stayed at a campsite and they did activities together and learned about, you know, we just did all types of experiential activities together. And, you know, this was for a lot of them their first exposure to either a white kid or a black kid or Hispanic kid. And so,
Right.
And then we would have another weekend later where the kids from the rural area would come up to Chicago, and we stayed in a hostel, and we did, you know, again, other experiences. And it was just a really positive, you know, event. And it was just nice to expose kids, you know, to different ways of being, you know, and from kids who live in the same state but have a different way of life and different exposure. And so if we can do that with kids, for sure we can do something, you know, with adults.
Right.
You know, to interact like that.
Great. So we need, Eric, please wrap me into the conversation because we can talk about this all we want. And so
that's what I was just going to say. Let's make a commitment right now. What are we going to do this week, at least amongst ourselves?
This week.
I mean, I'm definitely implementing my policy that if you start a sentence with "I'm not a racist," I'm just going to ask you not to continue speaking. And I think I can do that in a reasonable way, even if it's a patient. And my patients, now that I work on inpatient, they're all watching the news all day long anyway. I have very easy inroads to bring up current events, to all of my patients, and regardless of race, and ask how they're managing that and how I can be a support. So that'll be my commitment on a small scale this week.
Sandra, do you know the I'm Not a Racist video?
No.
Oh my Lord. Some famous guy, I don't know famous people, but look it up on YouTube. I'm Not a Racist, and it's a guy in a MAGA hat in a warehouse at one little tiny table in the middle of the warehouse, and the famous person is an African-American young man with dreadlocks, and they go back and forth, and it is powerful, powerful, powerful thing. And they're both actors, I think, but it's extremely well done.
The position that I've been taking this week is just expressing, mainly through social media, that, you know, we don't hate you. Matter of fact, we need you. Just putting out those messages that it's okay to be afraid to step into this conversation and say what you feel and get uncomfortable. So I've been inviting people to do that. I've just been saying it's okay to, you know, speak out. You don't have to be quiet. Actually, right now we need you not to be, because you aren't the enemy. There are enemies out there that we're fighting against, but if you care about the situation, then you're not the enemy.
Yeah, I think to go along with that, it's like silence speaks volumes as well. So if this is something you care about and something you want to change, put it out there. And also naming it too. I would just say I've seen a veiled attempt at, you know, trying to call out what's going on, but it was not like naming what it is, naming what's causing the suffering. And so again, it puts this message out there: if I'm not comfortable, I'm uncomfortable addressing this issue, that I'm not even going to put a name to the people who have been impacted. And I think just being able to speak it and say what it is gives voice to those who feel powerless as well.
I shared Sandy Schulman's statement about our country being in a racism pandemic with my staff, and posted it on our counseling center Facebook page, hoping my boss doesn't see that. Because I don't know if it's too liberal for her. But just, I'm gonna try to help my staff think about how we can be there for our clients this week, and you know, encourage them to also encourage each other and support each other at this time.
Yeah. I've also used this as a unique opportunity as well with my trainees. And so, you know, just thinking about a supervision I had this week, and my trainee asked how I was doing. You know, we were doing a check-in, and, you know, typically you might say, oh, I'm doing okay. But, you know, I felt it was important to just say, like, no, this actually has been a rough week, you know, a model that it's okay not to have it all together, you know, and it's okay to react to things, you know. So I thought that was important, you know, to model, especially as we're teaching diversity and cultural competence, you know, to upcoming psychologists. And also, again, you know, bringing it up with a couple, as my trainee was also listening to the session too. So teaching her, this is how you can bring it up. You know, there's no right or wrong way. Just bring it up and allow space for people to talk about what they're experiencing.
Well, I'm hearing us starting to reach a point of quiet across our town hall discussion here. So I wonder, Kira and Elizabeth, if we want to start thinking about maybe some closing thoughts and you know, take us towards our ending time today.
Sure. I can go first if you're okay with that, Elizabeth.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the message that we're trying to drive home is, the conversation started with, addressing racial disparities and just understanding racial disparities and how African Americans are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, and understanding that, the things that make them more African Americans more vulnerable is not just about them not taking care of themselves. Is they're at higher risk. They have lower access to health care, experience more discrimination, don't get the same treatment. And so all of these things, contribute to why they might have underlying diseases. And then you add on the recommendations on how you can protect yourself. Those also could unfortunately increase risk as well of harm. And so it's not an easy discussion to have, but, I think systemically, changes need to be made, policies need to be made, but also training is important, having conversations is important. This forum today is important. And so, I also feel I'm of the belief that if you know better, do better. And so, we've had these conversations, and at some point, it can't just be a conversation, there has to be some action. And so, just thinking of your role as a psychologist, if you also identify as an ally, thinking about what can I do? What can I do? How can I change? How can I be the change? Rather than possibly waiting on someone else to do it. All of us can feel empowered to do something, whether it's acknowledging it, reaching out to a friend, talking about it in our discussions and whatever platforms that we have, teaching our kids, our grandkids, our loved ones, having difficult conversations. Start somewhere. We all can do this together. You don't have to be alone in this. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add by saying that I'm really appreciative of all of you that joined this call today, and all of you that listen to us when we speak in different venues on these topics. The bottom line is that, and I think that Dr. Lewis and Dr. Ridley both mentioned this, that these were problems that have existed, and they've been existing for way too long. The COVID-19 pandemic has really put a magnifying glass on all of these situations. So for that reason, I'm thankful for the situation. It's terrible that, we're in this predicament, but at the same time, it's finally shedding some light for some people that never saw this before. This, for me, is a season of change. While everything is changing around us, we have to do change on the inside. We have to match ourselves with what's happening around us. Otherwise, there's going to be a huge mismatch, and then we don't know what we're going to be looking at toward the future. We feel oftentimes like completely out of control about what's happening outside of us. But the one thing that we can control is ourselves. And as long as we make that change within ourselves and we affect those around us, then we can see the change in the environment and our communities that we want.
Elizabeth and Kira both so articulately and just perfectly stated. I think on behalf of OPA, we can't thank both of you enough for sharing your time and your expertise and leading this conversation. Certainly these are challenging times on so many different dimensions right now. And again, I don't think any of us predicted that we would be where we're at today when we started conceptualizing this a number of weeks ago. So we are so appreciative to both of you. I think there were a number of actionable items with some linkages with some outreach that we can do. And we're going to certainly try to further that within the OPA leadership. And so, in fact, I was just finishing a message towards that effect. So, much like Cindy said, I'm not one to want to admire problems. I want to try to put action in place and try to move us forward. So hopefully we can start taking some incremental steps towards that end. Before we start to say our goodbyes, are there any other closing thoughts or reflections from any of our participants today?
I just wanted to say a special thank you to OPA for making room for a platform like this and to have such amazing, powerful, intelligent, and strong women lead this discussion and share such great insights. I think OPA is really taking steps in the right direction, and I'm very pleased to be a part of the organization. And I'm really glad that I was able to listen in, and I think a lot of people missed out on something that was pretty amazing. So just thank you all. And thank you to everyone who made comments and your heartfelt concern for people of color and for lives that have been lost and for a desire to save lives in the future. So thank you all.
I just want to say this was an actionable item, this forum, and thank you very much. And thank you, Elizabeth and Kia Ray and Eric and whoever else was involved in organizing this. Thank you very much. It's a well-spent couple of hours. Appreciate it.
And Josephine, I would be remiss if I didn't also extend our appreciation to you for your thoughtful commentary and sharing your time as well. Certainly you also added so much to our conversation today. So thank you too for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Michael is reminding us too that this program has been recorded and will be available on our OPA website. And so whether our ABSI colleagues who are a part of this call or for those members who may not have been able to attend, we can certainly link anyone to that, and that'll be posted probably in pretty short order, I'm guessing, Michael?
A couple of days.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation, specifically Dr. Cindy Van Kuren. Thank you for inviting me to co-present with Dr. Harris. This has been a great experience, and I've met a new friend and colleague, so I appreciate that.
And thanks for agreeing. Elizabeth's always up for anything that will help the rest of us. But Kia Ray, I told you I was going to rope you into OPA.
You did.
And we are an amoeba, so once we get around you, it's hard to get rid of us.
I appreciate it.
This was really timely. I was a late registrant, and after watching the news shows this morning, this was exactly what I needed. So thank you so much, both of you, for your generosity in having this today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I certainly would like to wish everyone comfort and peace tonight. These are unusual days and challenging days, and I hope all of us can maybe take some time tonight to practice your self-care and your wellness, however that might look. And again, thank you. And I think at this point we can say good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.